Harlem, 1963. A man spent 23 days secretly following Bumpy Johnson, tracking every move, every step, every face he met. He thought he was the hunter. He had no idea he was already inside a trap he couldn't see. Bumpy knew from day 3, said nothing, and simply waited. What did Bumpy do that made a trained professional question everything he thought he knew to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. Harlem, March 1963. The city was still waking up when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped out of his apartment on West 118th Street, the same way he had every morning for the past 4 months, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. He was 57 years old. He had just served 10 years at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the most feared prison in America. And he had walked out of that island fortress in November 1963 with nothing but the clothes on his back, a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm, and a mind that had spent a decade sharpening itself against the hard stone of confinement. 4 months back in Harlem, and he was still rebuilding, still reassembling the pieces of an empire that other men had tried to claim while he was gone, still reminding people, quietly and without drama, that his absence had been temporary, but his return was permanent. It was on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March that everything changed. Not with a phone call, not with a threat delivered through back channels or a message passed through intermediaries the way these things were usually done in Harlem's underworld. It arrived as a plain manila envelope, slipped under his apartment door sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning, left by hands that had come and gone without making a sound. Bumpy found it when he opened his door to retrieve his newspaper. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the envelope on the floor, the newspaper in his hand, the empty hallway beyond. Then he bent down, picked up the envelope, and carried both inside without changing his expression. He sat at his kitchen table, set his newspaper aside, and opened the envelope with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had learned never to let his hands reveal what his mind was doing. What he removed from inside stopped him completely. 12 photographs, black and white, crisp, professionally developed. The kind of images that required patience and equipment and a working knowledge of surveillance technique. The first showed him entering the coffee shop on 116th Street 3 days ago, captured from across the street at an angle that suggested the photographer had been positioned above street level, perhaps in a second-floor window or on a fire escape. The second showed him sitting in Morningside Park, alone on a bench, reading. The third showed him standing in front of his own building, key in hand, caught in the precise moment of unlocking his front door. There were 9 more photographs after that, each from a different location, each taken across the span of exactly 3 days, and each one making the same silent, unambiguous declaration. I see you, I have been watching you, and you never knew. There was no note inside the envelope, no name, no demand, no explanation, just 12 photographs arranged in chronological order, delivered anonymously to a man who had survived Alcatraz, who had outlasted rivals that other men considered untouchable, and who understood immediately and completely what this envelope was. It was not a message. It was not a warning designed to frighten him into submission or flight. It was a declaration of war delivered without words, by someone who wanted him to know the war had already begun before he knew it was happening. Bumpy sat at that kitchen table for a long time. He looked at each photograph carefully, not with fear, but with the focused attention of a chess player studying a board that someone else had set up while he wasn't looking. He noted the angles. He noted the distances. He noted what each photograph revealed about where the photographer had been standing. how long they had likely needed to remain in position, and what kind of professional discipline was required to operate that close to him for 3 consecutive days without triggering the instincts that had kept him alive through 30 years of underworld politics. Whoever had taken these photographs was good. Not exceptional, but good. Good enough to be dangerous. Good enough to be employed by someone who wanted results. He placed the photographs back in the envelope, folded it once, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he picked up his newspaper, poured himself a cup of coffee, and finished reading the morning news as though nothing had happened. Because in Harlem, in March 1963, in the world that Bumpy Johnson inhabited, showing fear was the first and most irreversible mistake a man could make. And Bumpy Johnson had not survived this long by making irreversible mistakes. 3 miles south of Bumpy's apartment, in a rented room above a dry cleaning establishment on West 83rd Street, Raymond Cole was developing photographs in a makeshift darkroom he had constructed from blackout curtains and a second-hand enlarger. He was 41 years old, and he had spent the last 3 days doing what he did better than almost anyone in New York City, watching people without being seen. Cole had been a detective with the New York City Police Department for 11 years before they fired him in 1958 for accepting payments from a numbers runner in the Bronx. A charge that was accurate, but that Cole had always privately considered hypocritical, given what he knew about the financial arrangements of half the men who signed his termination papers. After the firing, he had spent 2 years trying to rebuild legitimacy through licensed private investigation work, divorce cases and insurance fraud, and the occasional missing person, before accepting the reality that his former reputation opened certain doors more efficiently than any license could. By 1961, he was working exclusively in the gray space between law enforcement and organized crime, taking assignments from people who needed professional surveillance conducted without official record. He charged well, he worked cleanly, and he delivered results that satisfied clients whose standards were considerably higher than the average divorce attorney. His reputation in that particular market was excellent, which was why Vincent Caruso had contacted him in January 1963 with an assignment that Cole had initially assessed as straightforward. Study Ellsworth Johnson, document his daily movements, identify the people he met with regularly, the locations he frequented, the patterns and vulnerabilities that any man, no matter how careful, inevitably develops when he believes himself to be unobserved. Caruso had been specific about what he did not need. He did not need Cole to take any action. He did not need confrontation or escalation. He needed information. He needed a complete picture of how Johnson lived and moved through Harlem so that Caruso's own people could make decisions based on accurate intelligence rather than rumor. Cole had accepted because the money was substantial and because the assignment seemed manageable. Johnson was 57 years old. He had just completed a decade in federal prison. Whatever organization he had once commanded in Harlem had been distributed among other hands during his absence, and reclaiming it would take months of careful work that left him temporarily exposed and limited in his resources. Cole had surveilled men far younger, far more physically imposing, and far more actively dangerous than a recently released elderly criminal trying to reconstruct a dismantled empire. He had done his research on Johnson before accepting. He knew the stories, the reputation, the legend that had followed Johnson out of Alcatraz and back to Harlem like a shadow. But Cole was a professional, and professionals did not make decisions based on legends. They made decisions based on observable reality. And the observable reality of Ellsworth Johnson in March 1963 appeared to be a tired old man walking slowly through a neighborhood that had moved on without him. This assessment, Cole would later understand, was the most expensive miscalculation of his professional life. Cole's surveillance operation was methodical and thorough in the way that only someone with genuine field experience could execute. He never used the same vehicle 2 days in a row. rotating between 4 different cars he had access to through various arrangements. He never wore the same outer clothing on consecutive days. He never positioned himself at the same observation point twice in the same week. Mapping out 17 different locations across a 12-block radius of Johnson's apartment, from which he could maintain line of sight during Johnson's morning routine without establishing the kind of repeated presence that trained eyes could detect. He kept detailed written logs of everything he observed: departure times, arrival times, duration of each stop, physical descriptions of everyone Johnson interacted with, license plates of vehicles he entered or that stopped near him, addresses he visited that Cole could subsequently research through his own contacts. On day 3 of the surveillance, Cole had positioned himself inside a second-floor window of a building on 117th Street, renting the space for the morning from a building superintendent who asked no questions in exchange for cash. From this position, he had a clear view of the coffee shop entrance on 116th Street, where Johnson spent approximately 40 minutes each morning reading and drinking coffee before beginning whatever other activity his day contained. Cole had been in position since before dawn, patient and still in the way that good surveillance operatives learn to be, and he was reviewing his written notes from the previous 2 days when he noticed Johnson. Crossing the street below, glanced toward a parked vehicle on the opposite side of the block. It was a brief glance, half a second, perhaps less. The kind of thing a person does reflexively when movement in their peripheral vision catches their attention. Cole registered it and dismissed it immediately, because there was nothing significant about a man glancing at a parked car while crossing a street. But later that evening, reviewing his notes in the rented room on 83rd Street, Cole found himself returning to that moment. The car Johnson had glanced at was not Cole's vehicle. Cole's vehicle that day was a dark green Ford parked 2 blocks further north. The car Johnson had looked at was a gray Chevrolet belonging to no one connected to Cole's operation. Cole had logged it automatically as part of his standard documentation and noted the license plate, which he had subsequently confirmed was registered to a schoolteacher from Queens who had no connection to anyone in Harlem's criminal landscape. There was no reason for that glance to mean anything, and yet Cole found he could not dismiss it as cleanly as professional discipline suggested he should, because the gray Chevrolet had been parked in that same position the previous morning. Same location, same angle, different day. It was almost certainly coincidence. Almost certainly the schoolteacher from Queens simply parked in the same neighborhood 2 days running for reasons entirely unrelated to anyone's surveillance operation. Almost certainly. Cole made a note of it and moved on, because professional operatives did not let almost certainties disturb their concentration. But the note existed. The doubt existed. And somewhere in the architecture of Raymond Cole's experienced instincts, a very small warning signal had begun to pulse quietly in the dark. What Cole did not know, what he could not have known, because it was constructed specifically to prevent him from knowing, was that Bumpy Johnson had identified him on day 3. Not with certainty, not with the specific, documented confidence that would come later, but with the particular quality of perception that develops in men who have spent decades operating in environments where being seen before you see is the difference between control and catastrophe. Something about Cole's rotation pattern, some subtle inconsistency in the texture of the neighborhood's daily human traffic, had registered in Johnson's mind as a frequency that didn't quite belong. He couldn't have articulated it precisely on day 3. He simply knew, with the wordless certainty of long experience, that someone in his vicinity was paying the wrong kind of attention. And so, beginning on day 4, Bumpy Johnson began to perform. Not dramatically, not in any way that would signal to a trained observer that his behavior had shifted. The performance was in the details, and the details were calibrated with extraordinary care. He began leaving his apartment 12 minutes earlier than his established pattern. Enough variation to seem like normal human inconsistency rather than deliberate adjustment. He introduced a new location into his morning routine, a second-hand bookshop on 118th Street that he had never previously visited, browsing the shelves for 20 minutes before continuing to the coffee shop. He arranged to meet, on specific mornings, with specific individuals whose presence Cole would naturally document and attempt to identify: a former associate, a neighborhood pastor, a young man who ran numbers on the west side of the neighborhood. Each meeting was genuine in its own terms, each person real and connected to Johnson's actual life. But the timing and frequency of each was deliberately shaped to create a particular impression in the mind of whoever was watching. Every evening, after dark, Johnson sat alone at the small table in his apartment with a chessboard and a notepad. He was not playing chess. He was reconstructing Cole's day from memory, working backward from everything he had observed: the peripheral shapes, the repeated angles, the too careful absences in places where a genuine presence would have been unremarkable. By day 7, he had identified Cole's physical description with enough precision to recognize him at distance. By day 11, he had mapped 3 of Cole's primary observation positions. By day 15, he had tracked Cole to a public telephone booth on 119th Street and, from a position 40 yards distant with an unobstructed view, had watched Cole dial a number and speak for approximately 4 minutes with the focused, measured delivery of a man making a professional report to someone who expected precise information. Johnson did not need to hear the conversation. He had already identified Vincent Caruso as the most likely party with both the motivation and the resources to commission this kind of surveillance. Caruso had been expanding his operations into sections of Harlem that had historically been Johnson's territory, taking advantage of Johnson's decade of absence to establish arrangements that he had no intention of surrendering. Johnson's return was a direct threat to those arrangements, and Caruso was the kind of man who preferred to understand his threats completely before responding to them. The surveillance made perfect sense. The only question that remained was what form Caruso's eventual response would take, and to answer that question accurately, Johnson needed more information than Cole's observation alone could provide. He needed Cole to continue the surveillance. He needed Cole to continue reporting to Caruso. And he needed both men to remain entirely confident that their operation was proceeding exactly as planned. Which was why, on the morning of day 23, when Raymond Cole was standing in the narrow passage between 2 buildings on 117th Street with his camera in hand, waiting for Johnson to complete his route and pass within photograph range, and when Johnson appeared at the mouth of the passage and stopped directly in front of him, Cole experienced approximately 4 seconds of complete cognitive paralysis before his professional training reasserted itself. 4 seconds during which Bumpy Johnson spoke in a voice that was quiet, unhurried, and absolutely precise. "You've changed your car 6 times, but you've worn the same shoes every single day. Brown leather, left heel worn down on the outside edge. Small scuff mark near the toe cap." Johnson did not look at Cole. He was facing slightly away, as though addressing the middle distance rather than the man standing 3 feet from him. "On day 7, you had coffee at the corner of Malcolm at 47 minutes past 8 in the morning. You were at that corner for 11 minutes before you moved north." A brief pause, the length of a single breath. "On day 15, you made a phone call from the public booth on 119th Street. You were on the line for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. You called Caruso." Huh. Cole's hands had stopped moving. The camera hung at his side. He said nothing because there was nothing to say, and because some part of his professional mind recognized that speaking at this particular moment would compound an error that had already reached its maximum possible size. "I know who you are," Johnson continued, his voice carrying the same flat, factual quality throughout. "I know who sent you, and I have allowed you to believe, for 23 days, that you were doing excellent work." He finally moved a single step forward, unhurried, the way a man steps away from a table when a meal is finished. You were not doing excellent work. You were doing the work I needed you to do." He drew on the cigar he was carrying, exhaled slowly, and continued walking without looking back. His footsteps were even and unhurried on the pavement, fading with distance, until the passage was quiet again, and Cole was standing alone in the space between two buildings, with a camera he had never raised, and a mouth he could not make work. The entire exchange had lasted less than 45 seconds. 45 seconds in which Raymond Cole understood. With the terrible clarity of a man watching a trap close around him that he had believed he was setting for someone else. That everything he had assumed about this assignment was wrong. The old man he had been watching for 23 days had been watching him back from the beginning, and the question that arrived in Cole's mind in the silence of that passage, arriving with the slow, cold weight of something that had been true for a long time without his knowledge, was not what Bumpy Johnson knew. The question was why, knowing everything, Johnson had let him continue for 23 days. What was Johnson waiting for? What came next would answer that question in ways that Raymond Cole had not prepared himself to survive. 7 days after the encounter in the passage on 117th Street, a message arrived at Vincent Caruso's private office on the second floor of a restaurant he owned on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan. It came through an intermediary, a retired numbers runner named Arthur Bells, who had operated on the border between Harlem and the Italian neighborhoods for 20 years, and who was trusted by both sides precisely because he had survived long enough to understand the value of absolute neutrality. The message was brief, handwritten in Bumpy Johnson's careful, even script, and it said exactly this: "I want to meet. Room 714, Hotel Teresa. Friday, 10 o'clock in the evening. Alone." Caruso read the message twice, then set it on his desk and leaned back in his chair and smiled, the slow, satisfied smile of a man who believes a complicated problem has just simplified itself considerably. He called 3 of his closest associates into the office and read the message aloud, and the room filled with the particular quality of confidence that gathers around powerful men when they believe their opponent has miscalculated fatally. To Caruso and everyone around him, the message meant one thing with absolute clarity: Bumpy Johnson was afraid. 4 months out of Alcatraz, still rebuilding, still without the organization and resources he had commanded before his imprisonment. Johnson had looked at the surveillance, understood what it represented, and arrived at the rational conclusion that confrontation with Caruso's operation was a war he could not currently win. He was coming to the table because the table was his only remaining option. He was offering to negotiate because the alternative was to be dismantled by a man who had spent 10 years preparing for exactly this moment. Caruso did not send a reply. The absence of a reply was itself a reply, communicating acceptance on terms that the more powerful party did not need to articulate. He spent the days between receiving the message and the Friday meeting, making arrangements that he considered straightforward and necessary. 2 men would be in the room when Johnson arrived, positioned not aggressively, not in a way that would read as a threat before negotiation had taken place, but present in a manner that communicated the basic geometry of the situation clearly. Caruso would speak from a position of absolute strength, make his requirements plain, and give Johnson the opportunity to accept them gracefully rather than face the less graceful alternative. The meeting, in Caruso's assessment, would last no longer than 30 minutes. Johnson would leave having agreed to conditions that effectively ended his relevance in Harlem's underworld. The matter would be concluded cleanly, quietly, and permanently. Raymond Cole was given his instructions for the evening on Thursday. He was to be present in room 714 before Johnson arrived, positioned near the entrance. His role, Caruso explained, was as a witness to whatever agreement was reached, an independent party whose presence added a layer of accountability to the proceedings. Cole had accepted these instructions without visible reaction, which was the trained professional response, and had spent Thursday night in his rented room on 83rd Street, staring at the ceiling and understanding, with increasing precision, that the instructions he had been given described a function that had nothing to do with witnessing anything. Men like Caruso did not require independent witnesses to private negotiations in hotel rooms. Men like Caruso required something else entirely, and the specific shape of what they required was becoming clearer to Cole with every hour that passed between Thursday night and Friday evening. The Hotel Teresa stood at the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue in the heart of Harlem. 13 stories of dark brick that had been, through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the most prestigious hotel available to Black Americans in New York City, a place where musicians and athletes and politicians had stayed, where deals had been made and alliances forged in an atmosphere of genuine elegance. By 1963, its glory had faded somewhat, its clientele less luminous than in its peak years, but it retained a dignity and a weight of history that made it a serious location for serious business. Room 714 was on the 7th floor, a corner suite with windows facing both north and west, spacious enough to hold several people without crowding, private enough that conversation conducted at normal volume would not carry beyond the walls. Cole arrived at 9:30. He took the stairs rather than the elevator, a habit from years of professional caution, and let himself into room 714 with the key Caruso's people had arranged. The room was already partially set, a small table positioned near the center of the space. 3 chairs arranged around it, a floor lamp in the corner providing the only light, which was dim enough to create atmosphere without obscuring vision. Cole stood near the door and looked at the room for a long moment. He noted the table and the chairs and the way the lamp's light fell across the space. He noted the 2 men who arrived 20 minutes later, large and quiet, taking positions in opposite corners of the room with the practiced stillness of people who understood their function completely. He noted the full ashtray already on the table, placed there by someone who had anticipated that Caruso would smoke throughout the meeting. He noted everything with the automatic thoroughness of a man whose profession had trained him to observe. And what he observed, assembled together, produced a picture that required no interpretation. Caruso arrived at 9:55, moving through the door with the unhurried confidence of a man entering a room he owns. He was 58 years old, built solidly without being heavy, wearing a dark suit of a quality that communicated wealth without announcing it. A gold ring on his right hand caught the lamplight when he sat down. He looked at Cole briefly, nodded once, and settled into his chair with the relaxed authority of someone who has arranged every element of what is about to happen and is satisfied with the arrangement. He did not speak. He lit a cigarette, checked his watch, and waited. At 10 o'clock precisely, there was a single knock at the door. Cole opened it. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood in the hallway, alone, exactly as the message had specified. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him with a precision that spoke of careful tailoring rather than recent purchase. A suit that said this man had not dressed for a surrender meeting. He had dressed for something else entirely. He was carrying a dark leather briefcase in his left hand. In his right hand, between 2 fingers, was an unlit cigar. He looked at Cole for exactly 1 second with an expression that contained no surprise and no warmth and no hostility. An expression that was simply and completely neutral in the way that absolute confidence produces neutrality. Then he stepped past Cole into the room without being invited, looked at the 2 men in the corners, looked at Caruso at the table, and completed his assessment of the room's contents in the time it took him to cross from the door to the empty chair across from Caruso. He sat down, placed the briefcase on the table in front of him, and lit his cigar with a match he produced from his jacket pocket. He did not speak first. He simply sat and smoked and waited. Caruso let the silence hold for 15 seconds, long enough to establish who was controlling the tempo of the room, and then began. His terms were delivered with the smooth efficiency of a man who had rehearsed them and who expected them to be received as the final word on the subject, rather than as an opening position. Johnson would withdraw completely from his existing operations in Harlem's Central District. He would not approach, recruit, or make arrangements with any individual currently operating within Caruso's network. He would confine whatever activities he chose to resume to areas east of 3rd Avenue, which represented roughly 1/5 of the territory Johnson had controlled before his imprisonment. In exchange, Caruso would not move against Johnson personally, and Johnson would be permitted to rebuild quietly within the defined boundary without interference. "These are not negotiable terms," Caruso said, his voice carrying the pleasant finality of a man offering mercy he does not believe his position requires him to offer. "These are the terms. You can accept them here tonight, or you can leave this room and face what comes next without the option of negotiating. I'm being generous because I respect what you were, but what you were is not what you are." Bumpy Johnson listened to all of this without moving. When Caruso finished speaking, Johnson set his cigar in the ashtray, looked at Caruso for a long moment with an expression that had not changed since he entered the room, and then nodded, a single, slow nod that seemed to indicate comprehension rather than agreement. Then he reached forward and opened the briefcase. What he removed was not money. It was not a weapon. It was a manila folder, thick, its contents substantial enough that it made a solid sound when he placed it on the table. Then a second folder, then a third, then a small, reel-to-reel tape that he set beside the folders, with the careful deliberation of someone placing the final piece of an arrangement that has taken considerable time to complete. He aligned everything precisely, with the unhurried movements of a man who understands that this particular moment does not require speed. And then he leaned back in his chair and picked up his cigar again and looked at Caruso across the table. "Open the first folder," Johnson said. His voice was level and quiet and entirely without theater. The voice of a man reading coordinates from a map rather than making a dramatic declaration. Caruso looked at the folders for a moment with an expression that had not yet changed from the composed authority he had maintained throughout the meeting. Then, because not opening the folder would have communicated something he was not prepared to communicate in front of his own men, he reached forward and opened it. The first page was a financial record. The second was a photograph. The third was a letter, handwritten, on paper that bore the personal letterhead of a sitting New York State senator. By the time Caruso had turned 4 pages, his right hand had stopped moving. By page 7, the color had left his face with the completeness of a tide withdrawing from a shore. The folder contained 5 years of documented transactions, specific dates, specific amounts, specific account numbers in 3 different financial institutions, recording payments made between Caruso's organization and 3 state senators whose names appeared in public life as men of considerable civic reputation. The amounts were not small, the purposes were not ambiguous, and the documentation was thorough in the specific, meticulous way that suggested it had been compiled, not hastily, but over an extended period by someone who understood exactly what each piece of evidence was worth and had taken considerable care to ensure its authenticity was beyond dispute. The second folder contained photographs. The third contained transcripts of conversations, some of which matched recordings that were presumably contained on the tape reel. Caruso did not open the second folder. He did not need to. "I did not come here to negotiate," Johnson said into the silence that had settled over the room like a physical weight. "I came here to show you where you are standing." He drew on his cigar slowly. "You are standing on ground that I have owned for 23 days. Everything in front of you represents the terms that actually govern this conversation, not the ones you prepared." He looked at Caruso without hostility and without triumph. With the same flat, unfactual attention he had brought to every moment of this evening. Ha! The question you need to answer tonight is not whether I leave Harlem. The question is whether what is in those folders remains in this room or travels somewhere else tomorrow morning. The two men in the corners of the room had not moved, but something had changed in the quality of their stillness. They were no longer the static, assured presence they had been when Johnson entered. They were men who had just watched the architecture of the evening invert itself completely, and who were processing the implications of that inversion in real time without the benefit of instructions covering this particular situation. It was in this silence, in the precise moment when Caruso's composure had cracked and the room's power had shifted with the sudden, irreversible completeness of a tide change, that Raymond Cole looked at Vincent Caruso's face and understood the thing he had been avoiding understanding since Thursday night. The understanding arrived not gradually but all at once, with the force of something that has been true for a long time finally becoming impossible to not see. Cole was not in this room as a witness. He was in this room as evidence. The plan, assembled in its complete form in Cole's mind in the space of approximately 4 seconds, was clean and simple and characteristic of the way Caruso solved problems that required deniability. After this meeting concluded, however it concluded, Cole would be identified as the individual responsible for whatever violence Caruso's people intended to direct at Johnson. Cole's history made him ideal for this purpose. Fired from the police department for corruption, known to have accepted payments from criminal organizations, no institutional protection, no one whose interest it served to defend him. A man whose documented past made accusations against him not only plausible but expected. Caruso had not hired Cole to gather information. Caruso had hired Cole to become the explanation for something that had not yet happened. An explanation that would be entirely convincing because Cole's record made it entirely believable. Cole looked at Johnson. Johnson looked back at him across the table. And in the lamp's low light, his expression carried something that had not been visible to Cole before this moment. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one man for another who has just arrived at the same destination by a different road. Johnson gave Cole a single, almost imperceptible nod. Not an instruction, not a command. Simply an acknowledgement that the moment Cole had been approaching without knowing it had arrived, and that what Cole chose to do with it was entirely Cole's own decision. Cole reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His hand was steady. He removed an envelope, plain, white, unsealed, and placed it on the table beside Johnson's 3 folders. It made a flat, quiet sound against the wood. Then Cole stepped back and put his hands in his pockets and looked at Caruso. "I don't know who I was actually working for," Cole said. His voice was even and without inflection, the voice of a man delivering a professional assessment rather than an accusation. "I thought I did. I understood tonight that I was wrong." He nodded toward the envelope. 23 days of field notes. Every phone call I observed. Every location, every name, including the 3 conversations I documented that established that the arrangement for tonight was not what I was told it was. He paused. Including the conversation on day 19 in which the specific details of what I was being set up to be blamed for were discussed by people who assumed I was not in a position to hear them. The envelope sat on the table between 2 men who had, 60 seconds ago, occupied completely opposite positions in this room, and who now occupied a position that neither of them had entered the room anticipating. Caruso looked at the envelope. He looked at Cole. He looked at Johnson. Then he stood up, because sitting had become impossible, because the body responds to the collapse of a carefully constructed position by demanding movement, even when there is nowhere to move to. There was nowhere to move to. The door to room 714 opened from the outside before Caruso's hand reached it, operated by people who had been positioned in the hallway since 8 o'clock in the evening, 2 hours before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Because Bumpy Johnson did not walk into rooms without having already accounted for every door. Caruso bibachin ang ay sao jo. Kol bien mat koi New York trongvong bon moi tam gio, sao jem, thu sao. Kong jelai jia, chi hei, so jien tho ai hei, but ki dao vet nao man hung nguoi muon tim hanko de theo. Va Bumpy Johnson trovwe Harlem vao sang thu bei. Ngoik swang ban ko kua min tai kwan ka petren motram muoi South Street. Goe cafe. Vamo to bao sang nu the toi hom qua lamot boy toi hoan toan bain thuong. But there was one thing that Johnson never told anyone about what had happened in room 714, or in the 23 days that preceded it. He had identified Cole as a man being used rather than a man choosing to cause harm as early as the 7th day of the surveillance. He had seen it in the specific way Cole operated, the quality of a professional doing his job cleanly without the additional layer of personal investment that genuine malice produces. And from that day forward, the entire architecture of what Johnson had built across the following 16 days had been constructed not only to dismantle Caruso, but to place Cole in a position where his own survival required him to make the one choice that would make everything else possible. The question that nobody thought to ask and that Johnson never volunteered an answer to was whether Cole had made that choice freely, or whether Bumpy Johnson had understood Cole well enough to know. 16 days in advance, exactly what Cole would do when the moment arrived. 9 days after the Friday night meeting in room 714, Vincent Caruso was arrested at his restaurant on Mulberry Street by federal agents carrying a warrant that listed charges of tax evasion and money laundering across 7 counts spanning 4 years of financial activity. The arrest happened at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, quiet and efficient and entirely without the drama that attends the kind of organized crime takedowns that newspapers write about for weeks afterward. There were no photographs in the press. There was no statement from the district attorney's office framing the arrest as a victory against organized crime in the city. There was simply a man in an expensive suit being walked out of his own establishment between 2 federal agents, while his Sunday lunch customers looked on with the carefully arranged expressions of people who have decided not to have seen anything. Harlem heard nothing, not because the information was suppressed, but because there was nothing to connect the quiet federal arrest of an Italian businessman from Lower Manhattan to anything happening north of 110th Street. No shots had been fired. No bodies had appeared. No war had been declared and won in the visible, territorial way that Harlem's underworld usually registered shifts in power. One morning, the pressure that had been building against Bumpy Johnson's returning operation simply ceased, the way a headwind stops without announcement. And the men who had been watching to see which direction things would go found that the question had been answered while they were looking elsewhere. The operations that Caruso's network had been running in Johnson's former territory began to dissolve with the quiet efficiency of an organization whose leadership has been removed, and the space they had occupied gradually refilled with the arrangements that Bumpy Johnson had been methodically reconstructing since November. There was no celebration. There was no declaration. There was only the steady, unremarkable reassertion of an order that had always belonged to one man, returning to him as naturally as water finding its level. Johnson himself said nothing publicly about Caruso, about room 714, about the 23 days that had preceded it. He sat at his table in the coffee shop on 116th Street each morning, read his newspaper, played his chess, and received the people who came to him with the unhurried attention of a man who has nowhere more important to be. Those closest to him noticed that he seemed, if anything, quieter than before, not subdued, not diminished, but settled in the way that a man becomes settled when something he has been carrying for a long time has been set down and does not need to be picked up again. He never mentioned Cole's name in conversation. He never described what had happened on the 7th floor of the Hotel Teresa. When people in his circle, sensing that something significant had occurred without knowing its specific shape, asked him obliquely about the state of things, he would look at them with his particular quality of patient attention and say only that things were as they should be, and return to whatever he had been doing before the question was asked. Raymond Cole surfaced in Baltimore 14 months after disappearing from New York, working under his own name for a small insurance company that needed someone with investigative experience and asked few questions about employment gaps. He was not hiding. Exactly. He had simply moved to a city where no one knew what his face looked like in the lamplight of a hotel room on a Friday night in March 1963, and where the skills he possessed could be applied to purposes that did not require him to think too carefully about who was ultimately paying for them or why. He rebuilt his life with the methodical practicality of a man who has learned that survival is largely a matter of showing up each day and doing the next necessary thing without excessive reflection on the things that came before. But the thing that came before did not leave him. It lived in the specific, textured way that certain experiences live in the minds of people who have been present at a moment that changed the geometry of their understanding permanently. Years later, sitting at the kitchen table of a house in a Baltimore suburb with his teenage son across from him, Cole found himself attempting to explain something that he had spent considerable time trying to understand himself. His son was 17 and had asked him, with the direct curiosity of a young person who does not yet know which questions are too large to answer, simply, what the most important thing was that Cole had learned in his professional life. Cole was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "I spent 23 days watching a man, and I believed the entire time that I was the one with the advantage. I had the camera, I had the distance, I had the training. He was the subject and I was the observer, and that arrangement seemed clear and fixed and permanent." He paused. On day 23, he told me the exact time I had ordered coffee on day 7. He told me which phone booth I had used on day 15. He knew the name of the man I had called. Cole looked at his hands on the table. I had been watching him for 23 days. He had understood me completely in 3. Another pause. Longer. He knew I needed money. He knew I had been betrayed by the people who hired me, before I knew it myself. And he did not act on any of that knowledge until the precise moment when my knowing it too would produce exactly the result he needed. He did not save me out of kindness. He arranged things so that saving myself required me to do what he had already decided I would do. Cole looked at his son. I was a professional. I was experienced and careful, and I believed I was competent. And I was a piece in someone else's plan from the first day to the last. And I never felt it happening. He was quiet for a moment. That is the most important thing I ever learned. Not about surveillance or about criminal organizations or about how dangerous certain men can be. About how little we understand our own situation when someone more intelligent than us has decided to let us believe we understand it completely. What Cole had described without quite naming it was the specific quality that separated Bumpy Johnson from every other powerful man operating in New York's underworld in 1963. It was not physical strength, which had never been Johnson's primary instrument. It was not the fear his reputation generated, though that fear was real and usefully calibrated. It was something rarer and more difficult to quantify: the ability to look at another human being and read, with accuracy that approached the clinical, not just what that person was doing, but what they needed, what they feared, what they would do when those needs and fears were arranged in a particular configuration. Johnson had looked at Raymond Cole on day 7 of a surveillance operation and had not seen an enemy. He had seen a man being pointed at him by someone else's hand, aimed without Cole's full knowledge of what he was being aimed at. He had seen a man whose professional competence was real, but whose understanding of his own situation was dangerously incomplete. And he had understood, with the kind of patient strategic clarity that Alcatraz had sharpened rather than diminished, that the most powerful thing he could do with Cole was nothing. Nothing except arrange circumstances carefully enough that when the moment arrived, Cole's own survival instinct would do the work that no amount of force or persuasion could have accomplished as cleanly. This was the thing that made Bumpy Johnson genuinely dangerous in a way that size and violence and money could not replicate. He understood people at the level where their decisions are actually made, below the surface of what they say, and above the level of what they consciously know about themselves. He understood what they would do before they understood it themselves. And he was patient enough, disciplined enough, confident enough in his own reading of the situation to wait for the moment when that understanding could be applied with maximum effect and minimum exposure. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968 of heart failure, at a table in Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. He was 62 years old. He was found with a cup of coffee in front of him and a chess problem he had been working through on a small board he carried with him. The pieces arranged mid-game in a configuration that no one who found him was able to interpret. He had been sitting at that table for 20 minutes before anyone realized he was gone, which was, in its way, entirely consistent with a life spent in the practice of stillness. The newspapers reported his death with the kind of qualified acknowledgement they gave to men whose significance could not be denied, but whose activities could not be straightforwardly praised. A Harlem figure, a former numbers operator, a man who had survived Alcatraz and returned to the neighborhood that had made him. What the newspapers could not fully capture, and what the people who had known him understood without needing to articulate it, was that Johnson's real legacy was not territorial. It was not the empire he had built, or the enemies he had outlasted, or the decade in the most feared federal prison in America that he had survived without being broken. His legacy was a way of thinking about power that the men who came after him would reference and repeat and attempt to emulate for decades, usually without quite achieving its essential quality, because the essential quality was not a technique. It was a discipline, the discipline of patience applied to perception. The discipline of understanding that the most powerful move in any conflict is often the one that requires you to do nothing visible for the longest period of time while your opponent convinces himself that your stillness is weakness. The discipline of reading human beings at the level where they are most honestly themselves in what they need, in what they fear, in the small behavioral details that reveal the gap between what they know and what they think they know. One of his closest associates, speaking about Johnson years after his death, remembered a conversation that had stayed with him longer than any other. He had asked Johnson once what the difference was between a man who was merely dangerous and a man who was genuinely powerful. Johnson had been quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet when a question deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. Then he said, "A man who uses his hands wins one fight. A man who uses his money wins one season. But a man who understands people truly understands them, down to what they need and what they'll do when they're afraid. He wins the whole game before his opponent has put his pieces on the board." He had picked up a chess piece, turned it between his fingers, and set it back down. "The most dangerous thing I ever did in my life was nothing. I did nothing for 23 days and let a man believe he was in control, and that nothing cost my opponent everything." He had looked at his associate with the steady, patient attention that was the most consistent thing about him throughout his entire life. Learn to do nothing at the right time. That is the whole lesson. Everything else is just details. He was right. It always was.